Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online Ministers Forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, artists, and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us online science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get through these difficult times. Today I'm joined by Jaime González, the Houston Healthy Cities Director for the Nature Conservancy in Texas. We'll be talking about what it means to have a healthy city. He's a graduate of the University of Houston, holding both a bachelor's and master's degree from there, and has certificates from Duke and Yale in the environmental sciences. Jaime, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Let's just jump right in and talk about what is conservation.
Yeah, so conservation typically has meant that there are folks working to save wild places for any number of reasons. One is for the wildlife and the plant life that exists there, sometimes for the scenic views, sometimes for recreation, but usually it's something of a combination of all of those things. Today, the field of conservation is very rapidly evolving to incorporate human needs, justice, equity, and inclusion. So there is, in many ways, a real opportunity to have lots of different kinds of conversations that conversation has had in the past.
So let's talk about that a little bit more, because I know that one of the sort of controversies in the past with some environmental organizations has been this sort of debate about conservation with people or conservation without people, sort of the idea that wilderness is a place that is somehow separate from human existence. And I think that what you're talking about when you say there's this shift is exactly that sort of shift from away from a wilderness that is without people to one where we understand it as, I guess, a dialogue between humanity and the larger ecosystem. But could you sort of tease out that shift for us a little bit more?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that the way in which the West has kind of conceived of the construct of wilderness, and it is a construct, is that, and we still see this in calendars, in posters, in imagery, in nature documentaries, which on purpose exclude any people from shots, so that they can construct this notion of a pristine Eden that is separate from people and somehow elevated in that way. And I think we've all learned that growing up, that or have been inculcated to believe that true wilderness or true nature is somewhere out there, far away, almost untouchable, and that we get in our cars and our planes and go to it. I think that there's a lot of issues with that, and it's not helping us in times where we're dealing with climate crises and biodiversity reduction and things like that. I think that there are many indigenous communities around the world. I think all of our ancestors understood that humans are interwoven in nature so deeply and so completely through evolution and through culture that seeing ourselves as separate from nature is very damaging in many ways. And it also doesn't allow us to get to solutions. And so I think with my work here in the city, but also in lots of different contexts, I think it would be most helpful to think of ourselves as a vibrant yet connected part of a living world and a living planet. So, I tell people oftentimes that, ecosystem number one for me is my body. I am host to any number of species that are not human. In fact, there are more non-human cells in my body than there are human cells. So we ourselves are ecosystems within a broader ecosystem. So what we're talking about in conservation is how do we conceive of nature and the rest of nature, including but we're a part of nature, the rest of nature as something that we need on an everyday basis to allow us to be healthy, but also to meet our equity needs.
There's, I think, a number of threads that you sort of put there that would be kind of interesting to explore a little bit more. I mean, one is you talk about wilderness as a construct, and you talked about how nature shows construct an image of an hedonic wilderness, and I mean, I think that a lot of the most, vibrant ecological thinking says that that's very problematic, that kind of construction of that. And that, I mean, my understanding about a lot of what the Healthy Cities Initiative is trying to do is to actually kind of break down that construct. So could you talk, I mean, because like I think, well, wilderness is a construct. I mean, how is, this tree that I'm looking at, a construct, or how is a park a construct? So if you kind of explain that and how you all are sort of working to push beyond that into these kind of healthy city initiatives and stuff.
No, absolutely. I think that when you look at the scientific literature, there's an emerging branch of research that's looking at how have humans shaped lands and how have those lands shaped the humans there as well. And there are any number of examples now where we had an idea of how we thought the ecosystem was put together, but it really diverges from what we've found. So like the Amazon rainforest, which is held up, rightly so, for its tremendous amount of biodiversity and the importance it serves to the entire planet. But it's also held up as one of these places that's untouched or pristine. And when we actually look at what archaeologists are finding, it was a heavily managed ecosystem by indigenous peoples up until pre-Columbian times. And so what we think oftentimes is untouched by the hand of man actually has been manipulated quite a bit. The indigenous people here in Houston, indigenous folks have been here for over 10,000 years, and we pretty much know from the archaeological record that they were heavily managing this land with fire and hunting and things like that. So when we got here as colonists, Europeans and Americans, and unfortunately enslaved folks from Africa, it may have seemed like we were coming into this frontier that was untouched, but the truth is that it had been managed for thousands of years. Same thing on the East Coast. One thing I'd encourage your readers to do is, if they have a chance, is to read the book 1491 by Charles Mann. And it goes into the world before Columbus here, and it just shows you that people had a very dynamic and rich interaction with nature that is way different than the construct that we have placed on it, that there's wilderness over here and there are people over here. So what I'm trying to do in not just in the heart of the city, but really to think of the heart of the city connected to the suburbs and the exurbs, and then connected to the rural areas, as one continuous fabric of living communities. And they're all very different, but they're all intersected and they're all interwoven. So how can we bring nature, working aside communities, not for communities, but alongside folks, how can we bring in nature so that it can provide climate resilience, it can provide mental, physical, spiritual, and cultural health, and provide habitat for the rest of the species that we share this area with. And so when I think of any place, whether it's a parking lot, whether it is a primeval forest on the edge of the Texas coast, nature is everywhere. It's inside of us, it's on top of us, it's around us. And we know that it's really essential for human health and well-being. It is undeniably getting hotter. The most disinvested neighborhoods are oftentimes the hottest. There's real equity issues there, environmental justice issues there. So what it might look like is, millions of more trees to capture particulate matter, which is really bad for human health and well-being. And that would also help to alleviate urban heat issues. And if the trees were selected properly, which they should, for uplift of biodiversity, so you're not just planting random trees, but you're planting climate adapted, as much indigenous trees as you can, because they've co-evolved with the pollinators and the birds here. What you get is an uplift of human health, environmental health, and biodiversity health. And that construct, those three things taken together, is now called One Health and Well-Being. And that's what we try to attend to, is One Health and Well-Being, so that we're not just trying to solve one problem with one intervention, but you have one intervention that has a spidering effect of positive outcomes for the entire living community there. It might also look like more distributed flood control using green infrastructure. One thing that the city of Houston just did, which I think is an incredibly positive move, is it has incentivized, for the first time in history in the city of Houston, the placement of bioswales and ponds and other things that are biological to take in some of these floodwaters, clean the water, provide more nature, provide more habitat throughout the city. And it's a building program, and we've got lots to learn. But what it might mean is that instead of these just the giant reservoir projects or the bayou widening or things, you could have site level, neighborhood level, schoolyard level, green wetlands, which are providing lots of different functionality. It could mean using our power line easements for not just transmission of energy, but for trails, for prairie corridors that could go through the city and support things like monarch butterflies and lightning bugs. It could tie us back to a sense of history of this particular place, because the prairies help shape the cowboy culture and all that stuff, and the rodeo and barbecue. So I think that nature can be an extraordinarily hardworking thing for us if we just give it some room to operate. And then the philosophical note that I'll leave you with, it's not really a philosophical note, but I think it is something that if we're going to save the planet, ourselves, and this place, by extension, the notion that's getting in our way of all that is that biodiversity is it's a good thing to have once you get all the rest of the stuff, or it's not really that important, that humans have kind of figured out all these things, or we'll have technological fixes which will get us out of this. There's a recent report that looked at the UN Commission that looked at the real possibility of losing 1 million species over the next coming decades. And what that would do is it would seriously impede 80% of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that will factor into whether or not we have a healthy, sustainable planet for human beings. So if we lose the biodiversity, it's not just that we're not going to see these fascinating animals that kids can't find the wonder and all this stuff. It's going to seriously dent our ability to live on this planet as human beings. So I think what we need to do is actually figure out what our ancestors knew and many indigenous people know. Everything is connected, everything has a consequence, and we can't live without all the parts. Once you start taking parts out of the ecosystem, we're on the same ship, we start taking pieces off the boat, we're all going to sink. And so we need to figure that every single place where we can make interventions from a planning standpoint, a policy standpoint, and a project standpoint, to put nature around, it's going to be helpful to us.
So, just one thing there about sort of Unitarian Universalism that you are not intentionally bringing up, but you've connected to, is that the seventh principle of our association is the interconnected web of all existence, of which we are a part, and really celebrating that. And I think that, and acknowledging that, and making ethical and political decisions from that perspective. And I think that you're very much, kind of in line with that, saying that this is the thing that we need to really be focusing on as a species. Another thing that occurred to me is, did you hear this, that last week during sort of in the lead up to Earth Day, I don't know whether it was the U.S. government or somebody else announced, because it was in the New York Times, and I can't remember exactly the details, but that by 2050, if we don't do something about the climate crisis, it will have cost $23 trillion in damage and lost economic activity, which, just gets to your point of biodiversity. Like, there's sort of this false argument that's put out there, like it's economic development, or,
Right.
Or we can have like a nice, natural, pristine world. It's pretty clear that no, it's either human flourishing with some kind of true intentionality around our relationship with the earth, or it's all sorts of disasters that are not worth, thinking about. But we have to think about, because they're coming, right? And we've experienced them here in Houston, the Arctic freeze, the Hurricane Harvey, Tropical Storm Imelda. So, and I think one of the things that you're really sort of arguing is that it's impossible to separate these issues of human equity from ecological concerns.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely dead on. I think, for instance, with Hurricane Harvey, scientists have calculated, and environmental economists have estimated that $67 billion of the damage that Hurricane Harvey inflicted was enhanced by climate change. That's a massive amount of money. And you talk about those $23 trillion. and think about, and I know you're cognizant, but think about the cascading badness that will happen from that, where governments will have very little, they'll be cash strapped. And so social service nets and the ability to take care of those in need is going to be seriously damaged. There'll be, the number of climate refugees will be in the hundreds of millions of folks. The amount of disruption and chaos and hurting and human loss and disease is going to skyrocket. Here in Houston, we have about 10 days of temperatures that feel like 105 or more in a year right now. If we do nothing about climate change, by 2060, we're going to have 73 days that feel like 105 or more. So we're talking about converting big parts of the planet to uninhabitable. And then trying to find space and places for people to be. So no concerns that anybody has for equality, justice, inclusion, equity, any of that stuff is inseparable from the natural world. If we don't have a healthy planet, everything else that we're trying to do from a social services or social equity standpoint are all very much at risk. It seems like from a faith perspective, I know that you guys have the advantage of looking at lots of faith traditions and trying to draw from the best from each. When I think about the biblical story of Eden, there's a lot of things to go into there, but the thing that I reflect on is the first job in the world was like caretaker of the garden. And it's kind of like, don't mess this up. Here is a functioning, living system. Your first job is to recognize that you're a biological creature, and if you mess this up, then everything else goes to hell in a handbasket. So, I think that we need to get back to understanding that if we have economic systems or other things in play that are not in alignment with us being biological creatures on a biological planet and fully dependent on that planet, then I think that we're not going to meet with success. We can't make a system like that work. The balance sheets may work for a while, but biology always wins.
Well, and I think that's, people who are rightly concerned, which is, I think, a lot of people, right, looking at that reality, right, to say that, well, okay, look, it doesn't make economic sense, it doesn't make ecological sense, we have got to change the way that we're living. And I do think that even though it doesn't go far enough, the recent announcement of the Biden administration is at least room for optimism or hope, because there is some sense that, like, okay, there is at last people in office who are taking this seriously. But of course, there have been people who've tried to take it seriously in office for quite some time. Al Gore all the way back in the 90s. So, I think that the fact that it's now being phrased in economic terms may help push the conversation some, because, if you're you probably know this, but if you're an insurance company right now, you're totally freaked out, because you're looking at, how am I going to make a profit and insure people in a situation where we're looking at, an average of almost $2 trillion, no, a little bit less than that, a little bit less than $2 trillion in damages from climate change over the next 30 years. So hopefully that will motivate, the sort of power structures in some ways. I'm wondering, okay, so we've just had Earth Day, and I know that you all were actually very involved in Earth Day. Can you talk about what you did and whether, the kind of hope and inspiration you drew from it?
Yeah, I had the best Earth Day ever. I'm working on a project with A-Leaf ISD and an architectural firm called PBK and landscape architecture firms, TBG and Greenscapes. And the reason I'm kind of pointing those folks out is not a commercial, but rather an acknowledgement that they are making true on kind of the vision for a more resilient, more nature-connected space. So what we did is we did groundbreaking on a new preschool out in A-Leaf that is going to be incredibly rich from a nature perspective. It's going to have 4 acres of prairie. It's going to have over 200 species of indigenous trees. It's going to have areas that catch water and clean it before it goes out into an outlet, and it's going to absorb a lot of water. And I think this is going to get to one of the points that I wanted to make is that, in so many ways, so many of our neighbors, our congregants, all these folks, they take their civic responsibilities or moral or ethical responsibilities very seriously, and they bring that down to what they do in their home, their investments, and all those things. And I think one of the things that this project is so good at pointing out is, if we're going to save biodiversity, if we're going to save the planet, we've got to start doing that stuff at our house, at our campuses, at other places. We can't just say somebody out there in the ether is going to save all this nature. We do have to support those groups, absolutely, and that's where the big nature is going to be saved. But everybody's yard can be a little sanctuary, and this schoolyard is definitely going to be both a sanctuary for wildlife. It's also going to be a great place for preschoolers to get in contact with something that has been shown will increase their creativity, their focus, their self-esteem, and that thing is nature. So we oftentimes think about nature being a kind of added on for disadvantaged communities once we solve all the rest of the problems. The truth is, it's like art or anything else that's life-enriching and grounding. It reduces stress in oftentimes chronic situations. It provides awe. So I'm just super happy about this campus. I can't wait to see how it turns out. It's like a postage stamp national park in the middle of a neighborhood. And also what it does, it says like, hey, even schoolyards, parking lots, anything we got around here that can hold water, can cool the city, can provide biodiversity, can get people in contact with nature, anything counts. So we need to take a look at what are those lazy landscapes that we're just pouring a bunch of money and chemicals and other things into, and how can we convert those into something that's regenerative and giving back to the community and being a good neighbor to people downstream. And I think that's one of the big shifts, the titanic shifts that we're going to have to see in the city that is so disaster prone. We can't have a bunch of landscapes that are just sitting there not doing anything or actively contributing to people getting flooded out of their homes or heating up the city. We've got to start thinking about landscapes way differently than we have in the past.
So one of the things that you and I talked about earlier before we were recording this was the fact that you actually have done some of this in your own yard, where you've sort of converted your yard into a pocket prairie.
I have.
And I mean, I think that's just a really cool story and example of kind of like, okay, yes, we need to really think about policy. We really need to think about these big, huge economic structural changes because, like, at the end of the day, it's collective action, not individual action that's sort of going to get us to dealing with the climate change. I mean, like, that's just, incontrovertibly true. I mean, I can recycle all I want, or compost all I want, but until we have a different infrastructure, system, we're not going to make any progress. However, you have this really cool example of just, how as kind of a moral example and a place for your neighbors and people to sort of gather, you've turned your yard into a pocket prairie. So that's the advertisement. Tell us the story.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, and the story goes to the fact that I think it's easy to recognize now, particularly after the events of the last year, that in many ways we don't have an equity crisis, we don't have a climate crisis, we have a connection crisis. We have a sickness of solitude and siloedness. We don't feel connected to one another, and we don't feel connected to nature or the planet. We don't feel connected to the politics. And so anything that we can do in order to bring about more social capital, more social cohesion, a better connection to nature is great. And sometimes you can do all of those things at once. And so what I tried multiple years ago was I had an extraordinarily boring lawn. It was just mowed. There was nothing out in it. It wasn't doing much for anybody, frankly. And so I said, what if I just throw down some seeds and grow out this front yard into a spring prairie which showcases Texas wildflowers, and kids can take a picture, in the Texas wildflowers, and it'll provide some food for bees, blah, blah. And I thought, I'll try it out. And it looks really weird because there are all these dirt piles. It looks like my grass is infected with something. And then, sure enough, that first spring came up, and people were looking at me like, what in the world have you just done in this regular old neighborhood? You put in a wildflower meadow. And then what I thought I was doing was putting in wildlife habitat and a few places for kids to take pictures. But what ended up happening is it became a water cooler. People would stop by, they'd read the sign that I put in the yard, they'd talk to me, they take seeds, and then they tell me after, hey, I took some of your seeds. I said, oh, it's fine. Hey, I was taking a picture in your yard. Yeah, that was there. So it has become this place where if I'm not putting seeds down in September, people ask me literally in my yard, like, when are you putting down the seeds? We need to come see that. We see that every year, and we enjoy that. People come take pictures with their dog, and it breaks down this silo of like, that's your yard, that's my yard, this is your yard. To say, no, we're living in a community of folks that share space and time, and we want you to feel like you own this yard a little bit. And I've also documented all the species because I'm a biologist and a nerd. But I think that anytime we can do as many things as we can, all the stack benefits in one place with one project, that's what a win looks like. And we call it the Hatton Spring Prairie, and our whole house is landscaped with natives. We have a little pond and everything, and we jokingly refer to that as the Gonzales Butterwick International Toad Reserve. And it's just there's a guy named Doug Tallamy who I think some of your listeners should check out. And he's just a brilliant guy at the University of Delaware, and he's got this whole notion of a homegrown national forest. And basically, his contention is if a certain number of people in the U.S. convert their regular lots to more wildlife-friendly areas, that we basically collectively create what would be a new national park. And I love that notion that, to your point, collective action is where the big actions are. But I think we're going to have to internalize that there are no sacrifice zones, there are no sacrifice neighborhoods, there are no sacrifice areas when it comes to not only saving the planet, but also creating conditions that fight that crisis of connection. So it's all important.
One thing you mentioned when we were talking about this earlier that you didn't mention here that I thought was amazing was how many species have you counted in your yard?
I have over 200 species, and what's really beautiful about those species, there's a couple things that are really beautiful. One is that we know from the pollen record or the fossil record that some of these species have been here for 40 or 50,000 years. These are very ancient species, so there's a bigness in terms of the universe about that really strikes me. The second thing is because the prairie, and that's where I specialize in, the prairie both was shaped by and shaped the Texans. I'm talking about the Texan people. There is such a interwoven connection between our Western heritage, cowboy, rodeo, barbecue traditions, and this ecosystem. And so the great thing is it blooms most profusely around rodeo time. So we have people who park on our street and go walk over to the rodeo, and I feel like there's a living history thing there that's really critical. So it's not just for the birds. It's also just a grounding in place, and I think a lot of people feel rootless. They feel like they're not from a place. And so when we do these interventions in your yard or along a power line or in a city park, you say, no, this is deeply rooted in this place. It helped to make this place. It's the bones of this place. I think you give people a better sense of where they are in a very confusing and chaotic world where we feel rootless oftentimes.
So actually, I think that's a great sort of segue to an ending here, which is one of the things that's been sort of haunting this conversation is the distinction between space and place, and how space versus place is really, I mean, it comes from geographers. I mean, David Harvey talks about it, for instance, at great length. But within sort of ecological world, it's so essential to kind of upending our thinking about where we are and who we are and how we are. And you've been talking about it sort of, on the side here. It's come into the conversation. So I'd like to invite you at the end here to sort of talk about the distinction between space and place and just why it's so important for having a healthy city that's Houston rather than an abstract healthy city, why it's so important for our ecological work in, the physicality, the realness of it, rather than at some sort of just philosophical level.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a dynamic interplay between the two, and I think in terms of space and thinking about spaces in the city, as we've seen kind of this revolution in park redesign at Buffalo Pike Park, Memorial Park, Herman Park, and I've been a part of several of these processes. I think one of the things that design is looking for is how do you create spaces like the Eastern Glades in Memorial Park, for instance, or the new restorations happening in Herman Park that are that are designed in such a way to create intermixing of peoples that may not be from the same political geography or the same part of Houston or things like that. So I think that as we look at nature and how it can be set up in places, if it can be set up in places to create this plaza or this meeting center, civic space kind of thing, I think it's going to be great. I also think that in terms of space, sometimes people ask me, like, how big of a place do I need to have for a pocket prairie? And I think that we need to reconceive of, like, nature has to be in a giant place. Now, when they're in giant places, they're magnificent. They're the real arcs of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Nobody is contending otherwise. But even when you get a small space, I used to have a balcony, for instance, in an apartment complex, and I grew 3 species of native plants. You would not believe all the different pollinators and things that came to it. So I think that there's a lot of dimensions for all of that. I would say that if you want to do an intervention, don't let the amount of room that you have determine what you can do or not do, and just cut off. Anything is better than nothing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there are a lot of ways to look at that, and I think that they are very dynamic. One last thing about place and placemaking is there are a lot of elements that go into placemaking. I think sometimes we can create better sense of place when we both plant the right plant palette and when we interpret it well. So if we don't interpret it, people won't automatically know that it's a southern mixed pine oak forest, like in the Arboretum, as opposed to just some random forest with some random trees from some random places around the world. So I think it's both the kind of emplacement of particular species, but then the craft of the storytelling, the interpretation, the signage, and all that stuff can go, no, I mean, you are here in the universe, and you are here in this place. And what tells you that is the sights and sounds and smells of that place. And nature can be a very important part of that.
Well, thank you so much, Jaime, for being with us today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
All right. Well, I've enjoyed the conversation as well, and thank you for your work. And hope if your listeners have any questions, they'll go ahead and email me at jaime.gonzalez@tnc.org. And that first name is spelled Jaime. Welcome any questions that you have.
Well, hopefully some people will reach out to you. And for those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. If you found this video to be helpful, please consider joining us for our weekly online worship service. It's posted each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Central and features music and prayers. This week we'll be having our spring music service. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as it is possible for us to gather again. Please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we're all in this together. All right.